The whole diagnosis of DID, not formally, but the idea, you can go look back into Greek mythology, Egyptian mythology, and see themes of this idea running all the way through humanity. So it's kind of like we've always had DID, or some variation of it in features, as it's a coping mechanism. Makes sense. Around the time of the birth of modern psychiatry, with an individual you've all heard of, Sigmund Freud, he and his contemporaries actually saw quite a bit of DID. And, so Jung and Brewer and Freud, all these guys are kind of taking cases that from the literature, they actually wrote out a lot of the cases in some of the books that are published. And you can read the cases and see features and go, oh, yeah, that looks very much like what we call DID. So here's what happened. Freud published, I think it was in 1895, he published, and I'm taking this from an awesome book that you should read, by Colin Ross. It was, I think, published in the late 90s, but it's quite valuable, in spite of it being, how many years old is that now? 20 years old? Coming up on 20. So basically, they had cases of DID. Freud is sort of climbing in his prominence as, this emerging field that's getting ready to be birthed. So he and his contemporaries are studying these cases. He writes with Brewer, about a bunch of case studies, and almost the entire book is about cases that could be at least on the spectrum, maybe not full blown to the extreme extent DID, but there's certainly a lot of dissociative features and other stuff going on. Trauma. Females that have experienced sexual trauma, largely. They're writing this book. I think it's called, let me look up the name of it. Something hysteria. Let's see. Studies on hysteria, published in 1895. And kind of leading up to this point, the going theory is that this, I don't even think they have the label DID, but this pattern that they're seeing in these female patients that have a history of sexual trauma, is that this is real, real trauma that they experienced, that manifests as this coping mechanism to deal with that trauma. And so their way of trying to treat it and help someone in this case was to try to integrate them, etc. And that was kind of the going mode of evaluating the case. This book comes out with Brewer and Freud with this patient. The most famous case in the book is Anna O, who, as it turns out, is the daughter of a prominent figure in the Viennese society. And in fact, many of these patients that Freud is talking about and utilizing for his case studies are in fact daughters of his own, of people that are in his own social circle in the Viennese circuit. In fact, Anna O's family lives like a block away, like the next street over. She's been at their house. She's friends with Freud's wife. She actually at some point has a sexual affair with Brewer, the other colleague in question writing the book. And so there's, understandably, if Freud goes public with his, that his patients have been sexually abused as children, and that this is the theory in terms of how this develops, and he's talking about those actual cases, this is not going to go down very well, folks. In the society, I mean, he's going to have some issues that I'm sure you can see. So this is right around the time where his thinking has a dramatic shift, and all of a sudden he has this theory that goes something like this. Well, all this, hyper focus on and sexualization could be explained by this obsession, this penile obsession that developmentally occurs in young children, young girls, when they are incestuously pining after their own fathers. Right? He has this explanation that basically puts all his friends off the hook. You think that one's going to go over? Yeah. That's going to be the theory that's going to work. That's going to help him rise in prominence in the mental health field. He's going to be able to still be the modern father of psychiatry, and he can keep his friends all the same. And a lot of his contemporaries actually disagreed with him, other than Brewer, who had, he's having an affair with Anna O herself. So, of course, he needs a theory, too. So they're in cahoots, and this thing works, and this is really kind of the birth of modern psychiatry. There you go. So Jung disagreed. Jung was a student of Freud, and they had a parting of ways, and part of it were centered around this controversy, that Jung saw DID very much as existing, as a legitimate diagnosis, and he thought it was coming out of this massive amount of sexual trauma. And perhaps some of Jung's own issues. I mean, people have argued that Jung had his whole Red Book is, the story of his psychotic break. And so his stuff that he's in this same context, and he's like disagreeing with this way of seeing the world. And that was part of the parting of the waters. There was also other stuff that Freud tossed out the window in the process of having to have a way to explain away all these sexually abused females that have these symptoms, and it's still, so this basically influenced really the birth of much of modern psychiatry and psychology. I mean, who does everybody go back? Freud. So, after that, the other thing that happened that simultaneously around the same time, so basically by 1910, basically DID is falling out of being a diagnosis. Like, we can't label that. Why would we label that as DID? It's no longer really there. We're going to have some other explanation that Freud has conveniently supplied us with, that it's developmentally when young girls pine for their father incestuously and can't deal with that and have penile envy, right? I mean, but it's all coming out of this context of horrific sexual abuse. So the other thing that was happening at the same time, I meant to say, was that schizophrenia was becoming an explanation for all sorts of paranormal type experiences, hallucinations, particularly auditory hallucinations, and psychotic experiences were getting labeled as schizophrenic. And of course, when you have something like DID occurring, dissociation, there are features that are paranormal. And so that was convenient, because now you have another label that you could label this. So it's worth understanding. The same controversy kind of continues, because it was, the beginning of modern psychiatry and psychology, and persists even to this day. I mean, you can talk to people and they don't think, many mental health professionals do not actually believe in a diagnosis of DID. I'm of the opinion that it absolutely exists. And though rare, it typically occurs in these cases of extreme abuse, horrific torture-like trauma that happens, typically to somebody who's young, typically to females, young little girls whose fathers rape them sexually, or etc. That's the scenario. So, just wanted to weigh in on that. There may be more on this, but I encourage you to check out the book by Colin Ross, called Dissociative Identity Disorder, Diagnosis, Clinical Features, and Treatment of Multiple Personality. There's a wealth of information in it. And, if you care to, weigh in on the controversy here. I'd love to have some, comments that, get in a meaty discussion about it. Look it up. There's way more out there. I mean, there's a ton out there. So share your opinion if you feel so inclined. Thanks for tuning in, and adios.